Glad you're here. I'm Priscilla Zotti. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department. I look out here and I see lots of midshipmen, and the first thing I think of is, are they missing class? And you look pretty happy. I see several of my midshipmen that look very happy that they're missing class this morning for this conference. I know there's 22 midshipmen in a class in Nimitz called Civil Rights and Civil Liberties that are probably doing the happy dance that I'm here instead of with them. Let me tell you what they are doing this morning in my class. They're watching a video about a Florida drifter named Clarence Earl Gideon. Really somebody that you would all find to be invisible, somebody that you would not classify as a leader. He is accused, tried, and convicted of robbing a pool hall, of stealing money out of the vending machine. For that, he's sentenced to prison in Florida. And while sitting in his cell in Florida, he writes a letter, handwritten, to the Chief Justice of the United States, asking him to reconsider the fact that he was not given an attorney. The reason he wasn't, he said the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution should have provided that for him. Gideon is not a leader, and for most of his life, he's inconsequential. But what he does is change American law and history. Let me read a quote for you from the Attorney General at the time, Robert Kennedy. He said, "If an obscure Florida convict named Clarence Earl Gideon had not sat down in prison with a pencil and paper to write a letter to the Supreme Court, and if the Supreme Court had not taken the trouble to look for merit in that one crude petition in all the bundles of mail it must receive every day, the vast machinery of American law would have gone on functioning undisturbed." But Gideon did write that letter. The court did look at his case, and he was retried with the help of a competent defense counsel, found not guilty, and released from prison after 2 years for punishment for a crime that he did not commit. And the whole course of American legal history has been changed. Gideon, to me, is a powerful reminder of how individual effort advancing ideas can lead to change. Change can come from all sorts of places and not always from the top. So our panel today focuses on the followers of the organization, the contribution of followers to the success of them, and how one person can make a difference and facilitate change. What responsibilities do followers have to lead from below? How do followers toe the ethical line when leaders vacillate from it? So we have 5 presenters today that'll each talk about 8 to 10 minutes about their experiences. Let me tell you just briefly about them. First, we have Ambassador John Limbert. I'm very lucky to call John a friend and colleague. He currently teaches here at the United States Naval Academy. Second, we have Mr. John Gensler, a leadership consultant who focuses on energy challenges and how they relate to national security. We also have Mr. Ira Chaloff, a pioneer in the emerging field of followership. We have Major Heather Penny, a leader in aviation and a fighter pilot, and currently who works for Lockheed Martin. And lastly, we have Captain Wyman Howard, a member of the Joint Staff. Our format, we have about 90 minutes this morning to explore the topic. Each of our panelists will talk about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So while you're sitting here for about 40 minutes, 50 minutes listening to our speakers, be thinking about what you'd like to ask them. Take some notes, write some ideas down, so that once they're completed their presentations, you can ask some great questions. Let me begin with Ambassador John Limbert. John joined the Foreign Service in 1973, rising to the rank of Minister Counselor in his 34 years of career. Most of his postings were into the Middle East. He served as the ambassador to Mauritania. He holds degrees from Harvard University. Most of his writing extensively is focused on the Middle East. In 1979, after being posted for 12 months in the embassy in Tehran, he was taken hostage with 50 other Americans and held for 444 days. He's the recipient of the highest award in the State Department, the Distinguished Service Award. Mr. John Limbert.
Thank you. Thank you, Priscilla. I'm going to speak this morning from personal experience about a
failure of followership, personal failure of followership, and the catastrophic results that it had. It's not a pretty story. I should tell you that right at the beginning. I don't know if anyone remembers a comic strip character from the old comic strip Little Abner. His first name was Joe. His last name was an unpronounceable 7 consonants, which I won't say here because it was only pronounced as a rude noise. So I won't give his last name. But Joe was well-meaning. But wherever he went, storms, crashes, riots, floods, fires, and a black cloud over his head would follow him. Now, you may not see this black cloud hanging over me, but sometimes in my 34 years, I've been called the Joe of the Foreign Service. Either catastrophe followed me, or I followed catastrophe. It has not followed me to the Naval Academy, I'm happy to say. There are a lot to list. I won't list them all, but I'll mention 2. Iran in 1979, Iraq in 2003, in which the role of the follower and the possibilities available to the follower were very different. Now, the 2 cases, in my mind and in my experience, represent 2 extremes. A decade ago in Iraq, frankly, it didn't matter at all what the follower said or did. Come what may, we were still marching into that swamp. In Iran, however, over 3 decades ago, things were different. What I did or failed to do as a follower had consequences. The events there, as you well know, helped bring down an American president, graduate of this great school, and helped create a foreign policy mess that still, as my students well know, casts its shadow over our politics today. Now, in the interest of time, in this talk, I'm going to speak about Iran, and if we want to talk about Iraq, we could perhaps address that in the discussion. January 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the ruler of Iran for almost 40 years, a strong American ally, fled his country before the triumphant revolutionaries who were calling for an Islamic republic. In the summer of that year, the Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, asked our chief of mission in Tehran, Ambassador Bruce Langan, his views on whether Washington should allow the deposed Shah of Iran to enter the United States, as the Shah said he wanted to do. Ambassador Langan's reply was eloquent and clear. At some time in the future, yes, but not now. Given the very fragile situation on the streets of Tehran, to do so, Ambassador Langan advised, would bring 3 results. First, it would end any chance of there being a moderate post-revolutionary government in Iran. Second, it would end any chance of there being a normal or near-normal relationship between the U.S. and the new authorities in Iran. Third, and most important to me as a political officer then stationed at the embassy in Tehran, it would spell the end of our mission there. We would be gone. Now, everyone here knows the sad outcome, what happened consequently. A few months later, in October of 1979, despite the excellent advice from their diplomat in the field, they did it anyway. They admitted the Shah. Consequently, I and 51 of my colleagues spent 14 months as a guest of the Iranians. Jimmy Carter lost his presidency, and Iran-American relations went into an angry freeze that has lasted over 34 years. Now, in September, in those months, September, October of 1979, what was my responsibility as a follower, specifically a mid-level officer at the American Embassy? Well, first, about admitting the Shah, nobody asked my opinion, didn't expect it. But second, once it was decided to do this, on October 20th, 1979, it was my responsibility as a follower, as a team member, to say, fine, you did it. Here is the reality you now face. The fact is, in Iran, power has slipped away from the moderate officials of the provisional government and is now in the hands of vigilantes and street mobs. We are facing anarchy. Two, the extremists left and right are screaming anti-American vitriol every day in the radio, the television, the newspapers. Third, no one, and I mean no one, is going to believe our story about admitting the Shah to the United States for humanitarian reasons. And finally, the embassy and its personnel are in danger. The host government cannot protect us. Therefore, if this is the reality, what should we do? It should have been obvious. We take our people out of Tehran and deprive the mobs and the vigilantes of a target. Maybe things will calm down eventually, but as long as we have 70 American staff and an embassy and a vulnerable embassy compound of 23 acres, we are in danger. As for us followers, someone like me who spoke the language, who claimed to understand the political realities of Iran, did we say anything? As far as I remember, we did not. Perhaps why? Why did we not say anything? My students often ask me this question in class. Perhaps we were blinded. Perhaps we were having too much fun in the middle of a revolution. Sometimes revolutions can be fun, believe it or not. Perhaps we were afraid of being called chicken for talking about leaving. For whatever reason, the word evacuation, evacuate, were never spoken by those of us who should have been screaming that word. As a follower, then, that was my responsibility. Where was my failure? What should I have done? I needed to step back. I needed to make a cold calculation and say to my bosses, I am talking to people here. Conditions are deteriorating fast. You keep us here, you invite disaster. You have made your decision to admit the Shah, presumably for good reason. Now accept the consequences of that decision and get us out of here. The reality is that I never said any of that. None of us did. None of us did. It was my responsibility, and I think had I accepted that responsibility, maybe we could have affected the course of history and avoided much of the misery for our country and for many people that followed the attack on the embassy that came on the 4th of November. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Lundberg.
Pardon? Thank you. Not a pretty one, but
Our next speaker is Mr. John Gensler, a professional leadership consultant and a longtime leadership practitioner. He's a combat veteran, recipient of the Bronze Star. His adaptive leadership has been with a client list in government, private sector, and the nonprofit sector as well. Particularly, he's interested in climate and energy issues as they relate to national security questions. He's a graduate of West Point, MIT's Sloan School of Management, and the Harvard Kennedy School. Mr. Gensler.
Thank you, Priscilla, for that introduction. It's a tremendous honor to be here at the Naval Academy. Notice I see a couple of cadets in gray out there. Very happy to see that you all were able to make it down from the Hudson Valley. Ambassador, thank you for sharing that piece of your life with us. It's a pretty powerful story, one that I hope will resonate with this group. The question that you posed at the beginning about talking about your experiences, one centered in Iran in the late 70s, and then you brought up the topic of Iraq in 2003. So I think I'm going to take that invitation and dive into my experiences in Iraq a little over a decade ago. But I want to root them in what I think is a core question for this panel, and probably one of the core questions that this conference should be wrestling with. And it's relating to ethics. The question of how do you know what the right thing to do is in a situation, especially in a situation where your past experience isn't a reliable guide for the present or for the future, where the ethical frameworks that we've developed to help us make decisions no longer seem applicable because the environment around us has changed, the situation has changed, a revolution is afoot, everything is different. And that's a question I want you to keep in mind as I talk about my experiences in Iraq in 2003. So I was an infantry mortar platoon leader, leading about 30 American soldiers in the spring and summer of 2003, a role that many people in this room will be taking something very similar to in the short future, in the very near future. As this platoon leader in the tank battalion, for a period of about 12 weeks, I was asked to help stabilize and secure a city of about 60,000 people in northeastern Iraq. My tank battalion, covering an area of several hundred square kilometers. This one little square kilometer of ground was my domain. And the mission that I was given, as I said, stabilize, help this local government, which had recently fallen apart and suffered an invasion, help them get the power back on, get their water service operating again, keep the market open so that people could engage in commerce and provide for their families. And it became apparent very early that we'd need to operate with the local police, that they were going to be key, that my 30 Americans didn't have the ability to do this mission on ourselves. But the police station, shortly after the invasion, had fallen completely apart. And by the time that we arrived in this town, it had been almost totally ransacked and looted. The existing police force had dispersed. Many of them had fled or gone back to the countryside, had gotten out of the city. And the only people that we had there were a couple of retired policemen who'd been there several years before, and a handful of people that they were able to recruit. The questions ahead of me as tied to this panel are really tied about the ethical development and my responsibility for the ethical development of these folks. Now, in relation to the American soldiers that I was leading, I think it was very clear to me, and the lead up to war in the year or so that I had been responsible for them, their ethical development was certainly and almost solely my personal responsibility. But in any given moment on the ground, when they were out on patrol, when they were doing their job, the application of that ethical framework was their responsibility and rested with the individual. That's how I viewed it at the time and look at it with responsibility towards the American soldiers I was leading. Now, when it comes to the Iraqi police, I think it's a very different answer. You know, I had no formal authority over these folks. In fact, many of them probably viewed me as a squatter, an invading squatter who was living in their police station. And yet, my soldiers needed to be able to trust them, needed to be able to operate with them. And in a very real sense, their behaviors were going to be a direct reflection on the American presence in this town. Now, I think the disparity, or a gap that existed between the ethics that existed in my platoon and the ethics of this young Iraqi police force, we illustrated one day coming back from a patrol very early on during this time period. One of my sergeants decided to take a walk through the police station and encountered a handful of the Iraqi police brutally beating a handful of prisoners. This was a situation that in my platoon we'd gone over in the build-up to the war and on a fairly regular basis, and talking about how we know what the right thing to do is. And my sergeant immediately put a stop to it, using a combination of coercion, some restraining force. He stopped the brutality at the moment. And I think he set a good example for them that we weren't going to tolerate this. However, I don't think that he changed the ethical framework that these police were going to be applying. And I had no confidence that as soon as we turned our backs, or as soon as we were gone, that they would go back to their old ways. So the question is, what is my responsibility there to try to create an ethics, a framework, a set of guidelines for these Iraqis? And at the time, I considered that what I really needed to do, what was practical, what I had the ability to do, was at least try to create an overlap, some space of shared understanding. They weren't going to pick up the American Army ethic and embrace it at whole scale. But we needed to shift them in some manner. So that's what I took to be my responsibility for that. And this brings up three things that I think highlights a couple of key concepts as it relates to ethics, leadership, and followership. The first one is I think that ethics are not like laws. They're not applied retroactively. They're really not very useful to coerce people into behavior, to hold people to a standard. They exist within you. So they're not really like a legal framework at all. The second is I think that they're only really useful in the moment. Outside of a moment when a decision is being made, whether to act or how to act, ethics are kind of out there floating. They're hard to get a grasp on. But in the moment when you have to make a decision on what to do, they come into stark relief. And that is when they're at their most useful and most important. And the third thing about ethics is that I believe they must be deeply owned by the people who are expected to abide by them, felt very deeply. In fact, I think they need to be co-created by the people and developed by the people that you're expecting to abide by them. And how is this tied to followership? It comes back to the core question that I posed at the beginning, is how do you know what the right thing to do is in any given situation? Especially a situation where you don't know what the right thing to do is beforehand, and the situation is so utterly different from anything you've experienced before that you can't look to answers from the past. That is one of the core functions of leadership, is creating things in a land where you don't know what's going on, where you have to experiment, where you have to work, where you have to struggle through and wrestle with ideas to figure out what to do and what's going to create a successful environment for the future. It's very different from what I think of when I hear the word followership. And I hear the remarks from yesterday. Someone said one of the remarks was that leadership is dead, all that's left is followership. Or the idea that every follower is also a leader and every leader a follower. I'm of the mind that most of us do, what we do in most of our time is follow. In fact, the higher you go up in a hierarchy or in an organization, the more following that you have to do. You may not be following the orders of a person over you, but you're following standards, you're following a plan, you're following what's expected of you. And that is that's necessary. It serves a great purpose. But it's different from leadership. leadership exists when you have to go outside of that hierarchy, when you have to decide what to do, when no one's there giving you direction, when the past isn't a guide for what you're supposed to be doing now. And in the question of ethics, I think it's paramount, especially today, when the world is changing at a rapidly changing pace. The questions that you all are going to be wrestling with in the very near future, cybersecurity threats, the evolving nature of data and data mining and how that impacts business, how that impacts our national security. These are questions that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface on, and that the ethical guidelines from our past, I don't think they're going to be very useful to us in the future. So I hope we're able to dive into that a little bit today. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks. You guys were the bright spot.
Our next speaker is Mr. Ira Chaloff, an executive leadership coach with extensive writing on followership. He's penned 2 major books, one called The Courageous Follower, another The Art of Followership, and has earned a reputation as a pioneer in the field. His work strips away the idea of passive connotations of what it means to be a follower. Leadership Excellence magazine has ranked him one of the top 100 best minds in leadership. Mr. Ira Chaloff.
Thank you for the promotion to top 10 there.
Oh.
Field promotion. I have some prepared remarks, but I want to start off with acknowledging something that I heard on the news today, which was the death of the singer and songwriter Pete Seeger. Generationally, many of you may not know him, but you know of his work as he brought songs such as This Land Is Your Land and We Shall Overcome to our national culture. And there is a song that he wrote, which I always think of as a very, very cautionary tale about leading and following. And it's called Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. And it's about a captain who ordered his troops to ford a river at a place where his sergeant was warning him, do not cross, the water's too deep. And the captain didn't listen to his experienced follower, and he wound up drowning. And the sergeant then ordered the rest of the company back onto the shore to find a safer place to ford the river. I commend to you this song as you become leaders in your own right. 20 years ago, when I began writing my first book on followership, spell check would ask, did I mean fellowship? It didn't recognize the word followership. And today we're at a conference on followership at the U.S. Naval Academy. We've come a long way. When I asked Lieutenant Commander Kelly Welsh how the conference topic was chosen, she gave credit to the group of midshipmen who worked on the program. To me, their choice signifies a generational leap of some significance, and I thank them for it. I'm going to do a little test with you here. When you applied to college or to the academy, how many of you were asked to describe your leadership experiences? Please raise your hands. Look around. Everyone. Thank you. Put your hands down. And how many of you were asked on these applications, what was your followership contribution? No hands go up. So you see that generationally, and this I'm talking about my generation, we, I believe, misdefined follower as a personality type. We now understand it as a role. Everyone is a follower at times. If the Secretary of Defense isn't also a good follower, we have a constitutional crisis. So it goes all the way up as far as you can go. 20 years ago, I read an analysis of the events at My Lai in Vietnam. The author asked, how could a couple hundred American soldiers participate in a massacre and a cover-up? We think of ourselves as better than that, and we are better than that. How did this happen? He speculated that when individuals are in the follower role, they can displace their moral responsibility onto the leader. Right then, I wrote in the margin of the book, we need a book on a new way of following, and that's what I've attempted to do. In my model, followers don't serve leaders. That's an intentionally provocative statement. Both followers and leaders serve the mission, and they are both accountable for doing so according to a shared set of values. This is easy to say, but to do so requires courage. Not physical courage, but social courage. The willingness to stand up and stand out, and that's not always easy, as you know. Deference to hierarchy is wired into all cultures in varying degrees. Therefore, professional development requires preparing people to only be deferential when doing so is appropriate. Sometimes, deference is fatal. And this is not theoretical. The aviation industry in the 1970s found that most major fatal airline crashes occurred when a crew member did not speak up assertively enough to command in the face of situational danger. A role-play training program called Crew Resource Management became mandatory in all civil and military aviation. It prepared junior crew members to be sufficiently assertive when command has a blind spot. The safety record improved dramatically. Two behaviors of courageous followership are the courage to support the leader and the courage to question the leader. If these are developed in balance, command is more prone to listen to feedback from below. When this occurs, ethical transgressions can often be preempted. Nevertheless, sometimes taking a hard ethical line is required. Junior and mid-level officers must be inculcated with the skills to do so. If a flag officer is removed on grounds of a hostile ship environment, the officers below him or her share accountability. They didn't communicate early enough and firmly enough the impact of the senior officer's behavior so it could be corrected. Of course, there's risk in doing this. It still needs to be done. And while difficult, the actions can be successful and do not need to ruin a career. The highest profile example we have of this today in Washington, D.C. is the actions taken by James Comey when he was Deputy Attorney General. He and other senior leaders in the FBI and the CIA were prepared to resign if the White House insisted on an extension of warrantless wiretapping when it did not comply with the law as written at the time. Today, James Comey is the director of the FBI, having been confirmed by the Senate as a courageous civil servant. Mid-level executives and mid-grade officers must be prepared to courageously stand for doing the right thing at the right time. The attitude and skills of following courageously must be part of professional development curricula. I submit to you that the Academy can model this for the nation and for the world by incorporating these skills in midshipman training and assessment. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Major Heather Penny, who's a leader in aviation who was asked to follow unthinkable orders on an unthinkable day. Major Penny was ordered to down Flight 93 before it reached Washington, D.C. on September 11th. Her F-16 had no ordnances or munitions on board, and her task was to ram the airplane and bring it down, essentially to take a kamikaze mission. A graduate of Purdue University in English and American Studies, she was one of the first women to apply and be accepted into combat aviation when Congress opened those roles for women. She's been interested in aviation since her childhood, continues to pursue her passion working in it for Lockheed Martin as their USAF air superiority systems.
Dr. Zadi, thank you. And I appreciate the introduction because have any of you heard the joke, how do you know if a fighter pilot comes to your party? Don't worry, they'll let you know. So you all are somewhat captive to me today. Fighter pilots love to talk about themselves, and plus I'm a girl, so don't worry, we won't go over our 8 to 10 minutes. I'm not going to tell there I was stories. If it comes up because it's relevant, then we will. But what I want to impart to you as an opening salvo, if you will, is that leadership is a journey. We don't have any answers for you up here. As distinguished and as wise as the words that my fellow panelists have shared with you today, it's not binary. You're not going to walk out of this conference and suddenly have to stop studying leadership or striving in that growth because you've been certified a leader. So there's no secret sauce. And it's not easy, and it's not obvious, as I think Mr. Gensler's comments about ethics and the challenges of ethics are. It's something that you will have to continue to work at your entire life. Even once you've earned your commission or you've graduated and you've entered into the world, you will continue to need to struggle and apply yourself and continue to grow. This is a journey that will last you your entire lifetime. So if I were to give you some of my own experiences, impart my own lessons learned, it's that to always have that learning posture, always be open to those around you, and always be thinking and studying about what leadership means to you, where you are in your particular roles, what will be demanded of you. Just as, for example, Mr. Gensler mentioned that ethics are something that really are in the moment and that they're internal. If you don't think about these things beforehand, if you don't chair fly them, if you will, then how strong and how deep are those ethics really within you? Moral courage is the hard stuff. Physical courage is easy. But you know what, they don't really make a whole lot of movies about moral courage, things that blow up and people performing acts of physical valor. That's far more sexy in terms of Hollywood. But moral courage is the more essential, the more significant, the more important part of courage, and it's the most difficult one. So thank you for joining us here today at the Leadership Conference. I hope that what we have to say today will be helpful and useful to you. And I look forward to learning from your questions and learning from our fellow panelists. Thank you.
All right, now we come to the most fun part, I think, for most people here, is the question and answer period. There's 2 microphones, one in each of the aisles. If you would line up at the microphone, come forward. What we'd ask is you state your name. You can ask a question to any or all of the panelists. And I think we have probably, roughly about an hour left for questions. So please feel free to come forward.
Ambassador Limbert, would you be able to speak on the followership in Iraq in 2003? I would be interested in hearing more about that.
Very, very, very briefly. First of all, I said this wasn't a pretty picture. I apologize for the pessimism, but the heroes in Iraq, from my point of view, were people like Mr. Gensler here, our military colleagues, 02, 03, 04, the platoon leaders, the company commanders who were stationed in situations like he described, and immediately figured out that there was no book that told them what they had to do. And they went ahead and did it. And I found that very much to be the case. I had to protect, for example, one of my jobs, I was responsible for so-called cultural affairs, which included the Iraq Museum, for example. But one of my responsibilities was to protect a state-of-the-art printing plant that had fallen into the hands of some friendly militias, to keep it out of the hands of unfriendly militias. and I went through our chain of command. When I went through our chain of command, I found very little response. I mean, I had no troops or forces at my, as a political officer, I had no troops or forces at my disposal. So I went down some alleys and found a first lieutenant with a platoon in a local village, camped out at a school, and said, here's the problem. We do not want the unfriendlies to get control of this printing plant because they will make all kinds of trouble with it. They immediately understood. They didn't wait for any orders. They just did it. And there were hundreds of incidents like that, hundreds of things like that that happened in Iraq. On a larger scale, however, I mean, look, the whole operation was based on some assumptions, and think about them. One was that the Iraqis would welcome conquering foreign armies into their country. Second, that there was no need for us to enforce law and order in Iraq. The Iraqis would do that themselves. And once liberated from Saddam's tyranny, the Iraqis would organize some kind of secular democracy. And finally, having defeated Saddam's forces, our troops could leave in a few months and turn the country over to a new government. I don't know where these assumptions came from, but they certainly did not come from anyone who knew anything about the region, about Iraq, or even about sort of the history, the politics of the area. But as I said in my introduction, the situation was such that the best we could do, the best one could do as a follower using the ethics, was to alleviate a situation on the ground. The larger picture, really, that was beyond much, beyond any choices that we had.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, thank you for your comments today. My name is Anna Patton, and I'm a student at Tufts University. I was wondering, Captain Howard mentioned that we try to be excellent, but in the end we realize that we are flawed. So what is one of the ways that you found is the best way to balance being a leader, but also taking that time to reflect and be introspective and be able to say when you have made a mistake, but still move forward? Thank you.
Any other panelists like to?
Do you mind if I jump in? Thank you. We all are flawed. Well, I think one of the challenges we have as American society is we look at leaders and we want them to be perfect. We want them to be superheroes. They need to be better than Batman. But the fact is that none of us are from Marvel Comics. None of us are superheroes, and we do have those flaws. So knowing your limits is part of that, and building up your leadership team is also an essential part of being a strong leader. Fill yourself in with those whose strengths complement your weaknesses as you work to grow, identify, and build up those areas where you are weak. In the fighter community, debriefing is part of our culture. After we go out, we go fly, we turn the jets back over to maintenance, we go back to our debriefing room, we spin the tapes, and we very candidly assess each individual's performance on how they executed their game plan, how they executed their tactics, and we work to find root causes for where failures occurred, what contributing factors were, and we identify what went wrong in the mission. And even the best mission has flaws. Even though you might have successfully gotten into bad guy land with everyone alive, dropped your bombs, and then fought your way back out of bad guy land, and everyone came home and landed safely, things will still go wrong. So looking at failure or your flaws or your weaknesses, I think is an essential part of being a real leader. Leadership is practice. Leadership isn't an attribute. Leadership, it's a verb. It's a practice. So being able to candidly look at your failures, I think, is a critical component of being able to be honest and grow your strength of your leadership.
Yeah, I think this is a really quite important question that you bring up. It's a question of reflection and its importance to your success as a leader. No one's ever going to reward you for taking time to yourself to reflect on what you could do better. It's going to be tolerated at most. And when you're doing it, people are going to be wanting you to do things, to get out, to solve their problems, to fix the situation, to act. And taking time to reflect, to observe, to figure out what's really going on is going to be hard to do a lot of the time, unless you are working in a culture like the fighter community where it's become the norm, where it's part of the system. It's not part of the system in a lot of places, but it is absolutely critical to figuring out where to go into the future. And as someone who's been given the authority to exercise leadership or put into a role where it's expected of you, you're going to have to fight and struggle to create the time to reflect. But it is fundamentally critical to do that and recognize it's not going to be easy to do. People are going to put demands on you and want you to do other things. So blocking off time or finding mentors, finding a support structure that's going to allow you to do it is key.
Can I add something onto that, Mr. Gensler? You mentioned a support structure. And I think that's absolutely essential to bring out here is that you right now at your various colleges and here at the Academy are building an essential support structure for your future as leaders and commanders. Because I'll tell you what, when I look in the mirror, I am so beautiful. I might have to stand a little bit further away so I don't see the little lines around my feet, but it's harder for ourselves to be able to be honest and discreet about our own flaws. I mean, for example, we talked a little bit about failure. That's where we really learn. The last time I had a really great mission, I went home, patted myself on the back, and drank a beer, right? So your support structure is going to be essential to bringing honesty and a different perspective to where your shortcomings may be, whether or not that's a personal attribute or your own behaviors and actions. So continue the conversation. Leverage the relationships that you have here, both within your peers, your mentors who will be your commanders and supervisors, and your trusted subordinates as well. Your leadership team is 360. It's above, beside, and below you. And some of the relationships you're building here at the Academy will be essential to your success for the future, both in the service and when you exit the service, because they will be able to see the things within yourself and within your performance that you don't necessarily see yourself. When we go into a debriefing room after a mission, we look at everybody's tapes, and although the flight lead always has the primary responsibility for identifying and deconstructing the mission, he always says, did I miss anything? Does anyone else have anything to add? And invariably, it's a robust conversation. And don't shy away from that. It's absolutely essential. That support network that you brought up, it's critical.
Great question. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Hello, thank you so much for being here today. This question is for the panel as a whole. What is your advice to young professionals who find themselves in a situation where their personal values egregiously conflict with the actions of their senior leadership? And what should be the first step on the part of the follower in solving the conflict?
Mr. Taylor, would you like to begin?
Well, my first counsel would be to talk about that with your peers. That's part of the self-reflection. Even though my work talks a lot about how to help followers, help leaders see into their blind spots, we all have blind spots. So it could be that your sense of conflict with your leaders are stemming from something within you that should be examined first. But if you've done that, and you are clear that there is a values conflict, Then you need to construct a conversation to try to engage the leader and help the leader see what it is that you are having a problem with. Now, one of the ways to do this is to put yourself in the leader's shoes and say, what does my leader at this time in their career, in this situation they're in, what does he or she value? Because what he or she values is what they are going to pay attention to. So, for example, if you frame the problem you're having in terms of unit morale, and you know they value unit morale highly, you have a good chance of them listening to your perspective. And you then, I encourage you, if it's a difficult conversation and the scenario you're painting is inherently a difficult situation, I encourage people to work out what it is they want to say, even role play it if necessary first, before they have the conversation, and then be prepared to get some blowback from that conversation and not be thrown by it, but to stay clear on what it is you're trying to engage the leader about. Your job is not to get the leader to accept necessarily your proposal. It's to get the leader to engage in understanding of what the values issue is. And once he or she has done that, then a productive dialogue can occur and some productive solutions can emerge.
Anyone else like to tackle that question? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. First Class Yang. My question is for Major Penny. Ma'am, I was wondering if you could just share what was going on in your mind when you were scrambled for your flight on September 11th, and if you could talk a little bit about good followership and the personal cost to self.
Well, what was going through my mind was sort of the proverbial prayer, dear God, please don't let me mess this up. Because if at any point in my life what I did mattered, it was at that point in time. And when you ask the question about the personal cost to self, I think that's something that probably is what draws all of us here together, regardless of whether or not you're Air Force, Army, Navy, or Marine Corps. What brings us all together in service is that there is something in this world more important than our soft pink bodies. It's Constitution, it's mom, it's apple pie, it's baseball. It's all of these things that make up what America is. And that's why when you take your oath upon commissioning, you are giving up yourself for country, service before self. And that's why I say, you know, the physical courage, that part is easy. The moral courage is hard. Physical courage is easy because if something bad happens and you don't come home, well, you don't have to live with the consequences. Physical courage is stark. It's black and white. Moral courage, that's the part that's hard. And that's why, you know, to get back to ethics, that it must be very deeply ingrained. It has to be part of your core. It has to be part of your essence. You have to continually chair fly that, think about it, is because moral courage is the really hard stuff because you will have to live with the consequences. And again, I'm going to come back to service before self. And this I think, builds upon what Mr. Cherloff says regarding mission being the driving factor, the motivator. And that mission has to be married with shared values and ethics. Service before self, because when the mission and those ethics become more important than what happens to your soft pink body, that helps to clarify the issues before you. And it helps you accept and embrace the consequences for standing up and doing the right thing. Because sometimes the right thing is not going to be easy. And that's, again, why it's so important to have a strong network, a strong support system like what you're building here. And that support system, again, above, beside, and below, so that you continue that conversation, and that helps continue to build up and strengthen the core of your ethics. There is no easy answer for leadership. If it was easy and obvious, everyone would be a leader, and everyone would be an excellent follower. And we wouldn't need to have panels like this and conferences like this. We wouldn't need to study what leadership is if it was easy. And that's why it should be a continuing practice for everyone, for all of us, that we continue to learn. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for what you've done.
Michael Downing, Newport News, Virginia, study at Christopher Newport. This question is for the whole panel. I come from a very heavy military family, and what they have taught me is to treat people right, that luck is when preparedness meets opportunity, that true leaders emerge when the time's right and it's necessary. You work hard, you be open to critiques and other opinions. You know your people, you stand by your soul, and you tend to it, and be able to look at yourself in the mirror at night and say, God damn it, I did a good job today. Now, this whole discussion on followership, in your experiences, what is different than that? Is followership different and deeper than all the basic things we've learned as children and potential military men and women?
Followership, as we think of it, usually occurs in hierarchy. And hierarchy has a tendency to create a certain distortion in relationships. Hierarchy is critical. We have to have hierarchy in order to make large decisions and critical decisions. But what happens too often is that while hierarchy is an external role that tells us who can make what decision when, we too often internalize hierarchy, and we have this unexamined rule set as to how we are supposed to behave when we are in authority and when we are speaking to authority. And if that rule set isn't examined, it can interfere with the transmission of critical information so that the best decisions possible are made by the unit of leaders and followers. So there is an additional burden when you're in a formal follower role to be able to rise above the social constraints placed on that role. And when you have important data, important perspectives that will make a difference to the outcome or to the adherence to the values that are at stake, that you speak your voice effectively, clearly, humbly at times, but sufficiently assertively that you are heard and the people who need to hear you pay attention. So there's a certain skill set as well as attitude that goes with effective followership that we haven't always sufficiently developed, and that is critical that we learn to develop, particularly in our officer corps.
Yeah. Thank you. You know, Mr. Chalif and your question and some of the other questions are really hitting at some very difficult issues for which I think it's pretty obvious that there are not a lot of easy answers to it. Earlier, as part of one of the positions I held was president of the American Foreign Service Association, which is our Foreign Service Professional Association and union. And we have awards. We have what we call awards for creative dissent, which we give to various people within our structure, our members. And as far as I know, in the U.S. government, this is unique. I don't know of any other organization. Does the military do anything like this? I've never heard of it. if it has.
And you won it. right?
Pardon?
And you won this
You
award.
want it.
You won it.
Pardon?
You won it.
I did
Yes,
at
that's
an
the point.
earlier time, but many of our colleagues have, and the reality of dissent is that at many times it's not pretty. It's not easy. It isn't a question of coming and saying, well, I think we ought to do this instead of that, and everyone says, oh, that's a great idea, let's do it. It doesn't happen. It happens that way, may happen that way in the movies, but not in real life. Dissent, as we have seen, can end careers, and it has. It can split people within an organization. You know, our organization, and like the military, we're small. We know each other. We put a big price, a big value on collegiality and support. And dissent can split that. Dissent can cause problems inside of families. It can make friends into enemies. So it is not. Let us not fool ourselves. It is not easy, and it's not always a simple thing to do. Maybe the best advice one can give is sort of before push going out, saying, "Look, am I sure about this? And could I be wrong as well?"
Anyone else want to tackle the skill set of followership?
I want to build on the comments that Ira and John brought out. And this question, before you head out the gate thinking, can I be wrong? The really interesting question that all of you are going to face, and that all of us up here will face again, is knowing that you could be wrong and still having to act anyway, without 100% confidence that what you're doing is the right thing, that it's going to result in success, that everyone may not make it back inside the wire alive, and less consequential things as well. But having the courage to act when you don't know if what you're doing is right, and having the inability, you don't have enough time, you don't have the resources to know 100% that what you're doing is the right thing.
All right. Another question?
Good morning, panelists. Midshipman Second Class Kevin Lee. I quote Dr. Kellerman from yesterday's panel discussion. She said that you cannot have bad leadership without bad followership. Currently, our military is under heavy scrutiny, with high-ranking officers and senior enlisted service members being relieved of duty for sexual assault, bribery, hazing, and the list continues. Where are our junior officers and junior enlisted failing in followership, and what can we as junior officers expect to do to combat the ethical weaknesses in our superior officers? Thank you.
Want to take that?
Yeah, there's no easy questions here today.
I'm going to pass.
Clearly, one of the things that's going on with some of the examples of ethical failures that you're bringing up is, at least to me, positive, because we are recognizing them as ethical failures. Be careful when you see some of these high-profile cases coming out regarding hazing, bribery, gambling, etc. Don't attribute them to the broad officer corps in general, because what may be very sensational is not necessarily representative. The problem is when it becomes representative, when it becomes cultural. And this is really why military culture matters. War is an art. We can have tactics, techniques, and procedures that standardize how we do the 9 line for close air support. But that's fundamentally different from really the art of war. Decision-making, the fog of war, how you orchestrate your teams, that is all going to be handed down from someone who's experienced to those who are coming up and rising up through the ranks. So it's it's an artisanal culture with apprenticeships. And that's why who we are, how we act, and our ethics matter. You say, what do we do as junior officers when our senior leaders have been corrupted? Well, the answer is easy. You know what's right. When that then transgresses into being pressured to act wrongly or behave wrongly, I think that goes back to the earlier question about how do you have constructive or creative dissent. And then also, I think that creates the additional question is, if you see this going on, what is your duty as a junior officer when you've identified ethical lapses? And again, this gets back into the moral courage. What is the right thing to do?
Anybody else want to tackle that?
I can also say that courage, peer-to-peer courage, is as essential as upward courage. We all want to be fully accepted within our peer groups. So sometimes we stay silent when we observe our peers walking too close to ethical lines or crossing them. I think that's a critical practice ground for any of us, is to find the moral courage to take a stance with our peers and start to create that ethical culture at our level. Then if we see transgressions occurring at higher levels, we have sort of developed our ethical muscle, if we will, to take on the more difficult task of orchestrating those conversations up the chain of command.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Cadet Dickey from Virginia Tech. Mr. Shalefield said earlier that leaders aren't born, but they are created. You said a follower is a role, not a personality type. So my question is, are there those who are born to be better followers, to fit that role better, or are they created? And if they are created, how do we as leaders help our subordinates develop good followership so they, in turn, can be better leaders?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because some people after my seminars or workshops come up to me and say, you know, I always have been more comfortable in the follower role, and I've always felt a little badly that I don't aspire to be a leader. And you've helped me understand that the follower role is equally honorable if it's done well. So I think there is some variation in human drive. But nevertheless, I think it's the individuals who are in the formal leader roles can do a lot to create an environment in which what I call courageous followership is valued rather than just compliant followership. Remember, courageous followers support their leaders 100%, despite difficulty, danger, challenges, if what the leader is doing is seeming to support the mission and the values. We only get into the dissent or the divergence where what the leader is doing is threatening the values or the mission for whatever reason. So leaders who create an environment in which they clearly do value dissenting views or divergent views before they make their final decisions help create the most effective type of followership. I spoke at the War College a number of years ago, and one of the officers said, at every meeting, we appoint someone to be devil's advocate, except, frankly, they used a little more racy term. D stood for designated, and I won't tell you what A stood for. But the point was that they institutionalized the role and the value of divergent thinking and divergent speaking. And I think that leaders can play an important role in that regard. However, I have to be quick to respond that we can't put the full onus of this on our formal leaders. as followers, even if the leader is not creating that kind of milieu, we have to have the courage to speak according to the values and information that we're working on. So followers need to dig deep and find additional courage when needed. Leaders need to create an environment in which less social courage is needed in order to speak up.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. Kendall McBroom from Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia. This question is directed to you, Mr. Gensler, but anyone on the panel can add advice or suggestions as well. How do you go about instilling or reinstilling a strong, sustainable, ethical framework in a failing or degenerating organization, community, or institution?
So your question is, how do you create or instill?
Like if the ethical framework is falling apart, or there just needs to be an ethical framework, how do you go about instilling that?
Okay. I think that this is a question about purpose and why we do what we do. Fundamentally, separate from the question of what should we do and whether we should do anything at all, this is a question rooted in the why. And if you're looking to create a framework where none exists, an ethic, a sense of what is right, it needs to be rooted in the values, the history, the lineage, the geography, the reality of this community that you're trying to create it for. And if it's separate from that, it's ultimately going to fail. So the question is really, I think, one about purpose. What is the purpose that you're trying to achieve? What brings this community together? What is the uniting set of factors about it? And if you, as a leader orchestrating this conversation where there's a failed ethic or a non-existent ethic, the role that you could play is to orchestrate the conversation to get to the root of what it is that they actually want to do. And I think that's going to be a guidepost to help creating a sense of what you should do, why you should do it, how you should do it, which are the root questions of ethics, whether and what to do. But it has to be rooted in purpose. And this question, that's why I think this is a question about why, which is a core question of leadership. Because leadership, as we discussed, can be messy, can be dangerous, can be risky. And if you're not firmly rooted in why you're doing it, you're going to be much more likely to succumb to pressures to do something else. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir, it does. Thank you. May I come for a minute? It's a good question. They teach us in negotiation school to separate the person from the problem. The reality, however, is sometimes the person is the problem. It happens. I can remember I was once a deputy in a mission overseas, and the morale was terrible. We were all at each other's throats. There was sort of every day was a battleground. It was a battleground, and whatever we tried, nothing worked. And our chief of mission left one day. He went. His tour of duty was over. As the number 2, I took him to the airport, escorted him. We went to the airport. He got on the plane. I came back to the embassy. When I got back, the champagne corks had been the champagne had been uncorked. And people were dancing on the desks. And I looked around and I said, well, I understand this, but this is not seemly. Shut up, let's shut the place down and everybody go home. But he was replaced within a week or two, and it was night and day. I mean, the same people who were at each other's throats, who were just fighting constantly, it was completely different. We're friends, and everyone and people were working together. So sometimes it'll happen that way. I mean, there isn't a solid answer. And the principle of separate the person from the problem, it's a good principle to use but sometimes, in fact, it is the problem. And there are problems that don't admit to, an easy or book solution.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Please.
My name is Daphna Bierson from UC Berkeley, and my question is directed toward Mr. Gensler, but I would welcome any other comments. Mr. Gensler, you spoke of your time spent collaborating with police in Iraq in 2003 and how moral and ethical questions arose. Do you think certain ethics and morals are universal? If not, when is it justified to push one's moral and ethical standards upon people of other cultures?
Thank you for finishing this off with a doozy of a question. I do appreciate, it's something that I've wrestled with then and I wrestle with today. This question of universality of ethics, of concepts of right and wrong, good versus evil. Personally, I do believe that there are some things that we can universally say are right or wrong. I don't believe that all issues are black and white. Values are important, an important dictator of culture. I always think of culture as an outcome. It's not something that exists before we behave and before we interact with one another. Values, I think, are also something that arise largely out of our behavior. They're learned. We, as a society, small or large, we begin to value what advances us. And what advances us, what makes us stronger, what causes societies to rise and fall, I do believe change through time. They evolve. That's just why earlier I mentioned that I think the role of someone in a leadership position is to evolve our ethics. As we wrestle with new situations, as our abilities change, as we advance technology, new situations inherently are going to rise up that we haven't dealt with before. And I don't think that there's a black and white a priori answer about whether it's right or wrong. We have to wrestle with it. And that's one of the fundamental challenges that we're going to face, is figuring out what to do when we don't know what to do. So I don't want to cop out. I do think there are some fundamental things that are right and wrong in the world that, based on humanity and based on what's going to advance human civilization, I think we could answer. But the interesting questions are about the gray in between and how we decide what's right or wrong in a situation that we've never encountered before.
Yeah. Again, thank you for that. I think, John, you're being a little modest here. I have, from what I saw in Iraq, we sent a lot of people over there, or too many people over there, in our mission, who were very good at preaching sermons, and we did that very well. We supplied sermons about rule of law and civil society and pluralism and transparency, and all of these things. We were very good at that. But it was people like John working on the ground, people who were working with the local imams in the neighborhoods, with the local neighborhood chiefs, with what was left of the local bureaucracy, who actually had to get things done, and found the tools that they had to do. And these things, as I mentioned before, these things do not come out of a book. I don't think we teach them here at the Naval Academy. Say, what do you do? What do you do when? But it's a basis. I mean, it's the basis of education and an ethical and intellectual background that you take into these situations.
All right. Our time is up. I'm really glad that you attended. Leadership is obviously more than just being a leader, but working with followers. Let me just leave you with a quote I have on my office from an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Please help me in thanking our panelists and for Commander Welch and the midshipmen that have put on this great panel. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time, your participation, and for your insights. On behalf of the Naval Academy and Leadership Conference staff, we're pleased to present you with a gift as a token of our appreciation. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking them one more time.
Thank you.